After his wife's secrets come to light, Jack faces a choice: stay trapped in betrayal or break free. This is his story of starting over, rediscovering old passions, and forming a bond that changes everything. Can Jack rebuild his life from the ground up? Welcome to RedHead Cheating, your premier YouTube channel dedicated to unveiling jaw-dropping and unbelievable tales of infidelity. We are your go-to source for the most shocking and scandalous cheating stories that will leave you both horrified and intrigued. Join us as we delve into the secrets, lies, and betrayals that have rocked relationships and shattered trust. Our channel is committed to sharing these cautionary and eye-opening narratives, not to glorify cheating, but to shed light on the devastating consequences it can have on individuals and families. Cheating is a painful way to end a relationship and often leaves the other partner in a dark place. By presenting these stories, we hope to alleviate the pain you're experiencing by helping you realize that you're not alone. We are a media company focused on delivering the highest quality stories. Sometimes based on true events, our narratives always conclude with a valuable lesson, adding educational value to each video. I'd spent months preparing myself for this day in court, but nothing could have prepared me for what unfolded. As I sat at the long wooden table, trying to remain composed, I kept replaying the events that led me here. My wife, Kathy, had betrayed me in ways I hadn't thought possible, and I was determined to sever all ties. I was there to move forward, to leave the pain and deceit behind. But as the judge entered, my lawyer leaned over, warning me that Kathy's team was planning to push for marriage counseling instead of an immediate divorce. I took a steadying breath as Kathy's lawyer stood up, his voice polished and confident. "Your Honor, my client requests that the court orders a series of marriage counseling sessions to help repair the damage to this relationship. Mrs. Porter believes that with time and the right support, there may still be a way to rebuild." I felt my stomach turn. Rebuild? After everything she'd done? My lawyer must have seen the shock and anger on my face because he shot up from his chair, addressing the court in a calm but firm tone. "Your Honor, my client, Mr. Porter, has clearly expressed his wish to move forward with the divorce. There are substantial grounds for this, given Mrs. Porter's multiple extramarital affairs. In addition, Mrs. Porter is currently expecting a child that is not Mr. Porter's. Given these circumstances, we believe counseling is not a viable solution." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the words blending together in a low murmur that felt like salt in an open wound. I clenched my fists under the table, willing myself to remain composed, though every fiber of my being screamed to speak out. Kathy's lawyer continued, attempting to argue that she was committed to making amends, but I could see right through the act. This was a desperate attempt to delay the divorce, and nothing more. The judge's gaze fell on me, his expression one of careful scrutiny. "Mr. Porter," he said, "I'm inclined to give both parties the opportunity to work through these issues constructively, especially given the presence of an unborn child. I am ordering a month of counseling, 2 sessions per week, to see if any resolution can be reached." My frustration must have shown because he fixed me with a stern look. "And you will attend, Mr. Porter," he said, his voice leaving no room for debate. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on me, and I knew I had no choice but to agree. As I left the courthouse, I could barely process what had just happened. The idea of sitting through counseling sessions with Kathy was unbearable, but there was no avoiding it now. Little did I know that those counseling sessions would only deepen the wounds she'd inflicted, setting off a chain of events I couldn't have imagined. This was just the beginning of a long, painful road, one that would eventually lead me to truths about Kathy, and myself, that I'd never anticipated. The following week, I arrived at the counseling office with my mind already made up. I wasn't there to reconcile or rebuild anything with Kathy. I was there because the judge had ordered it, and I had no choice. The office was dimly lit, designed to be calming, but the setting felt anything but. My stomach tightened as I saw Kathy seated in the waiting area, her hands folded neatly on her lap, her expression carefully neutral. She glanced up as I walked in, giving me a small smile that I didn't return. The counselor, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor named Dr. Reeves, ushered us into her office, gesturing for us to sit across from her. I took a seat as far from Kathy as possible, my arms crossed defensively. Kathy sat quietly, hands clasped, her gaze on the floor. I wondered if she would bother to admit any part of what she'd done. Dr. Reeves started off with the usual questions, asking each of us to explain what brought us to this point. Kathy spoke first, her voice soft, as though she were trying to evoke sympathy. "I know I've made mistakes," she said, her eyes flicking to me. "But I believe we owe it to ourselves and our years together to try and find a way forward." I barely contained my frustration, interrupting her before she could continue. "Mistakes?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Calling it a mistake doesn't exactly cover months of lies, affairs, and now, a child that isn't mine." Kathy flinched at my words, but I was beyond caring about sparing her feelings. Dr. Reeves held up a hand, calming the tension between us. "Let's keep this respectful. I'm here to help you both communicate openly, even if this process brings up difficult emotions." I took a breath, reining in my anger for the sake of getting through this, if nothing else. Dr. Reeves turned to Kathy, encouraging her to respond. Kathy, to my irritation, launched into a polished version of events, omitting details and downplaying her actions as misguided decisions. She painted herself as someone who had been lost and confused, a woman caught up in a moment of weakness, who had made poor choices. Listening to her felt like another betrayal. There was no accountability, no genuine remorse. Just a series of well-chosen phrases that turned her betrayal into something that sounded almost forgivable. When Dr. Reeves asked me to share my perspective, I felt my anger surge again, but I tried to keep it steady. "This isn't a mistake we're talking about," I said, keeping my tone controlled but firm. "This is months of lying, breaking promises, and violating every ounce of trust one ever had in her. She didn't just slip up. She made a choice, over and over, to put herself and her wants above our marriage." Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully, giving me a moment before she spoke again. "It's clear there's a lot of pain here, and it's important that both of you acknowledge the impact of your actions on each other. Kathy, do you fully understand what Jack is expressing here?" Kathy nodded, her gaze lowering. "I know I hurt him," she murmured, a slight quiver in her voice. "But I still believe we can work through this if we just try." I felt myself tighten up, a heavy realization settling over me. She wasn't here to make amends, she was here to control the narrative, to convince herself, and maybe even me, that her betrayal wasn't as bad as it felt. She wanted to hold on to the marriage for reasons I could no longer understand, reasons that felt selfish and manipulative. As we left the office, Kathy glanced at me, offering an apology I'd heard too many times. "Thank you for coming, Jack. I really do want to make this work." I looked at her, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "I'm here because I have to be," I replied. "Not because I believe anything you say." I walked away, feeling the burden of her manipulation even more than before. This counseling wasn't going to bring us closer, it was only going to show me exactly how far apart we truly were. The counseling sessions continued over the next few weeks, each one more draining than the last. Each time we sat in that room, Kathy spun a carefully constructed narrative, talking about rebuilding trust and learning from her mistakes, all while sidestepping the reality of her choices. Her words were polished, rehearsed even, but to me, they rang hollow, empty apologies layered over betrayal. During our fourth session, Dr. Reeves attempted a new approach. She asked us to go through what had brought us together in the first place, the memories we'd shared, the good moments. Kathy jumped in eagerly, recounting our first dates, vacations, and the early days of our marriage with an almost theatrical warmth. I sat there, numb to it all. Every word felt like another layer of manipulation, a strategy to paint her actions in a softer light, to make it seem as if those good memories could somehow outweigh the months of deceit. Kathy was trying to pull me back in, appealing to the history we'd shared. But the more she talked, the more I felt that history slipping further away, replaced by the reality of what she'd done. When Dr. Reeves turned to me, I struggled to find the words. I wanted to remember the good times, I really did. But I couldn't look at those memories without feeling the sting of betrayal. They felt tainted, like snapshots from a life that no longer felt like mine. I don't know if I can do this, I said finally, my voice steady but raw. Everything you're talking about, Kathy, feels like it belonged to someone else, someone who didn't destroy everything we had. Kathy's expression faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, attempting to look hurt. I understand you're angry, Jack, she replied softly. But don't you think that we owe it to ourselves to try? We had something real. I shook my head, unable to hold back my frustration. We had something real until you decided it wasn't enough for you. Now you're here, trying to convince me to stay, but I don't even know who you are anymore. Dr. Reeves stepped in, attempting to redirect the conversation, but the damage was done. I'd finally said out loud what had been brewing inside me since this all began. Kathy's remorse felt like nothing more than a desperate attempt to keep me under her control, to maintain an image of a marriage that no longer existed. As we left the session that day, Kathy caught my arm, her eyes pleading. Jack, I know I messed up, but can't you just give me a chance to make things right? I looked down at her hand on my arm, feeling a sense of finality settle over me. I've given you every chance, Kathy. But you can't fix something you destroyed willingly. I walked away, my mind clearer than it had been in months. I realized that these sessions were no longer about healing or finding common ground. They were about finding the strength to let go. By the 5th session, I'd grown weary of Kathy's performance in the counselor's office. Week after week, I listened to her scripted confessions, each apology polished but shallow, as if she were reciting lines from a play. She never once showed the raw honesty I needed to see, the true remorse that would reflect an understanding of the pain she'd caused. Instead, she focused on what she wanted, reconciliation on her terms, control over a situation she'd created. Dr. Reeves must have sensed my frustration because, halfway through the session, she turned directly to me. Jack, you've been fairly quiet today. Would you be willing to share where you're at emotionally? What are you hoping to find in these sessions? I paused, feeling the weight of the room settle over me. I knew what I needed to say, but I wasn't sure I was ready to face it aloud. I took a deep breath, finally meeting Dr. Reeves' steady gaze. I came to these sessions hoping for closure, a way to find peace with what's happened, I said, my voice steady but strained. But every time I sit here, I feel like I'm listening to a version of the truth that's been watered down. I'm not sure there's anything left here for me to save. Dr. Reeves nodded, her expression understanding. She turned to Kathy, encouraging her to respond. But Kathy looked stunned, her composed facade cracking for the first time. Jack, I know it's hard to believe, but I do love you. I thought you'd see that if we could just talk things through. Her words barely registered. I could see right through them, see her desperate attempt to pull me back. But after weeks of forced counseling, her pleas sounded hollow, as if she'd convinced herself that saying she loved me would erase the betrayal. Kathy, I replied, my tone even, love isn't something you prove with words. It's something you show through actions. And your actions have told me everything I need to know. Silence filled the room, thick and heavy. Kathy looked away, her eyes filled with an emotion that might have been guilt, or maybe just frustration that her attempts at damage control weren't working. I felt a flicker of regret, but I knew it wasn't for her. It was for the version of our life I'd once believed in, the future I thought we'd have. Dr. Reeves shifted in her seat, her expression one of quiet understanding. Sometimes, the healthiest choice is to recognize when a relationship has reached its end, she said softly, her words a quiet validation of everything I'd been feeling. As the session ended, Kathy stayed seated, her expression unreadable, while I stood up, feeling an unexpected sense of relief. I thanked Dr. Reeves for her time and headed toward the door. Just before I left, Kathy called my name, her voice breaking. "Jack, are you really done?" I turned back, feeling the weight of her question hang in the air. But I knew the answer now, and it was one that had been taking shape in my mind for weeks. "Yes, Kathy. I am." With that, I walked out of the office, leaving behind the broken pieces of a marriage that no longer felt like mine. After that final counseling session, I knew what I had to do. The time had come to make my departure from Kathy's life official. I returned to the house the following day with a firm decision in mind: I would pack up, leave, and finally start fresh. Walking through the front door felt surreal. This was the place I'd once called home, a space filled with memories I'd spent years building. But now, each room, each object, felt like a reminder of what I'd lost. The framed photos on the walls, the worn couch where we'd spent countless evenings, even the kitchen table, it all felt like it belonged to someone else, a version of me who'd believed in a future that no longer existed. I headed upstairs to gather my things, moving from room to room, packing up what mattered and discarding what didn't. As I worked, I found items that brought back memories, some fond, some painful, all bittersweet. In the back of the closet, I stumbled upon an old photo album from our early years together. I flipped through it, each image capturing a moment from a life that felt distant, almost foreign. Part of me wanted to keep the album, a piece of the past to hold on to, but I knew that wasn't what I needed. Holding on to these memories would only anchor me to a life that was over. I placed the album in a box marked for donation and continued packing, each item I let go of feeling like a small step toward freedom. Midway through, I heard the front door open, and Kathy's footsteps echoed down the hall. She must have seen my car parked outside. I braced myself, knowing she would want to talk, to plead her case one last time. "Jack," she called from the doorway, her voice hesitant. Are you really doing this?" I looked at her, feeling a calm resolve settle over me. "Yes, Kathy. I need to move on. I can't keep holding on to something that's already broken." She nodded, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I never wanted it to end this way," she whispered, her tone a mix of regret and something that might have been sadness. But I couldn't bring myself to feel anything for her now, not anger, not forgiveness, just a quiet acceptance that this was the end. I packed the last of my things, shouldered my bag, and walked past her, pausing only to leave my set of keys on the table by the door. Kathy's eyes followed me, but she didn't say another word. As I stepped outside, a weight lifted from my shoulders. I felt a strange sense of relief, a lightness I hadn't felt in months. For the first time in a long time, the path ahead was mine alone, unburdened by the lies and pain of the past. I drove away without looking back, ready to embrace whatever lay ahead. That evening, as I settled into my new apartment, I took a deep breath, letting the silence wash over me. It was just me now, no more doubts, no more pretending. The life I had shared with Kathy was behind me, and I was finally ready to start anew. Moving into my new apartment marked the beginning of a quieter, simpler chapter. It wasn't much, just a modest one-bedroom place with bare walls and minimal furniture, but it was a space that belonged solely to me. I had left behind everything that tied me to the life I'd shared with Kathy, determined to start fresh without reminders of the past. In the mornings, I'd stand by the small kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching the city come alive beneath me. It was the first time in years that I had felt truly alone, and I found that I didn't mind it. There was a strange comfort in the quiet, a sense of peace in the absence of expectations or compromise. At work, I threw myself into new projects, volunteering for assignments that would keep me busy. My boss noticed my renewed focus, often assigning me to high-profile projects that kept my mind occupied and challenged. The long hours helped, the routine offering a sense of stability when so much of my personal life was in flux. Emily, my sister, checked in regularly, her steady presence a source of comfort. One evening, she came over with a pizza and a bottle of wine, insisting we have a housewarming of sorts. As we sat on the floor of my still-bare apartment, she listened patiently as I talked about everything: Kathy, the counseling, the move. "You know," she said, pouring us each another glass, "I'm really proud of you, Jack. You did what most people can't, walked away from something that was hurting you. That takes strength." Her words resonated deeply. For so long, I had seen my choice to leave as a last resort, a response to the betrayal I'd endured. But hearing Emily say that I'd shown strength made me see things differently. I had chosen to respect myself, to prioritize my own happiness, and to leave a situation that no longer served me. Over the following weeks, I began finding small joys in solitude. I spent my weekends exploring parts of the city I'd never taken the time to visit: art galleries, quiet bookshops, and hidden coffee spots that became new favorites. I took up running again, hitting the trails at sunrise, letting the rhythm of my steps and the early morning stillness quiet my thoughts. The physical exertion became a form of release, each mile a step further from the pain I was leaving behind. I started picking up old hobbies too, like cooking and reading, filling my free time with activities that brought me a quiet sense of fulfillment. My apartment slowly began to feel like a home, decorated with things that reflected my own tastes and interests rather than compromises I'd made in a shared life. I filled it with plants, a few framed art prints, and bookshelves packed with novels I'd been meaning to read. One Saturday morning, as I sipped my coffee in the living room, I realized just how far I'd come. There was a time when being alone had terrified me, when the idea of leaving Kathy felt like the end of everything I knew. But now, solitude felt like a gift, a time to reconnect with who I was without the influence of anyone else. I wasn't fully healed, and I knew that the scars of betrayal would take time to fade. But as I looked around at the life I was building, I felt a growing sense of hope. This was my life now, and for the first time in a long time, I felt free to live it on my own terms. As the months passed, I found myself feeling more at ease in my new life. With the space to breathe and grow on my own, I began reconnecting with parts of myself that I had left behind during my marriage. One of those parts was music. Before meeting Kathy, I'd always played guitar, a pastime I'd found calming and fulfilling. But over the years, I'd slowly let it slip away. One evening, on a whim, I visited a local music store and picked up a second-hand guitar. It felt unfamiliar in my hands at first, the strings biting into my fingers, but the muscle memory was still there. I started playing again each night after work, letting the chords and melodies bring a sense of calm and clarity I hadn't felt in years. Before long, I was spending hours each weekend at local music spots, listening to live performances, and connecting with other musicians. It was here that I ran into an old friend, Liam, who had been part of my life before Kathy and I got married. We'd lost touch over the years, each of us going our separate ways, but as we caught up over a drink, it was as if no time had passed at all. Liam was quick to notice the changes in me, the difference in my energy, the new life I was building from the ashes of the old one. "You know, Jack, I'm glad you're back out here," he said, raising his glass with a grin. "You're finding yourself again. And I have to say, it's good to see." Our friendship rekindled easily, and Liam started inviting me to small gatherings with his friends, people who shared his love of music and creativity. We'd spend hours talking about music, laughing, and sharing stories from the past. Being around them felt invigorating, reminding me of the passion and curiosity that had once driven me. One evening, Liam convinced me to perform at an open mic night at a nearby bar. At first, I resisted, hesitant to put myself out there. But eventually, I agreed, telling myself it was a step forward, a way to break free from the self-doubt that had built up over the years. As I stepped onto the small stage, guitar in hand, nerves surged, but I took a deep breath and played. The audience's warm response, the thrill of performing, and the energy in the room reminded me of who I'd been before everything with Kathy. I was reclaiming pieces of myself, rediscovering passions that had once defined me. The open mic night became a regular event for me, each performance a reminder of my resilience and my ability to rebuild. Music had become more than a hobby again, it was a lifeline, a way to express everything I'd been through without words. With every note I played, every evening spent laughing with friends, I felt a growing confidence in who I was becoming. I was no longer the person I'd been during my marriage, defined by heartbreak and betrayal. I was someone new, stronger, someone who had faced pain and come out on the other side. And in those moments, surrounded by music and friends, I realized that I wasn't just moving on, I was thriving. Through Liam's group, I found myself in a circle of new friends who shared my passions and understood my journey. At one of our gatherings, Liam introduced me to a woman named Grace. She was a freelance artist, easygoing, and quick-witted, with a warmth that immediately put me at ease. Unlike the hesitant friendships I'd tiptoed into after the divorce, my connection with Grace felt refreshingly simple. She was someone who had clearly faced her own share of life's challenges, and that understanding seemed to bridge the gaps in our conversations. One weekend, our group decided to go on a short camping trip. It was an impulsive idea, just a few tents, some supplies, and a promise of fresh air and laughter. We arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, the sun casting a warm glow over the trees as we set up. Grace and I ended up working together to pitch our tents, exchanging stories and jokes as we tried, and failed, to get the stakes to hold in the rocky ground. That night, as the fire crackled and everyone settled into quiet conversations, Grace and I wandered to the edge of the clearing. The stars were bright, and the stillness of the forest wrapped around us, creating a space that felt almost sacred. We stood in silence for a moment, both of us lost in our own thoughts. Then, out of nowhere, Grace asked, "Jack, do you ever feel like the past just lingers, even when you think you've moved on?" Her question caught me off guard, but I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "All the time," I admitted. "I've done everything to move forward, to build something new. But sometimes, it feels like the past is still right there, reminding me of everything I went through." Grace nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I think that's normal. We carry parts of our past with us, but they don't have to define us. They just shape us, I guess." We talked well into the night, sharing stories about the things we'd lost and the lives we were building from the ground up. Grace spoke about her own journey, about how she'd left behind a painful relationship and rediscovered her love for art. Her openness resonated with me, her courage and resilience a quiet reminder of how far I'd come, too. As the fire died down, we walked back to the camp with a shared understanding that didn't need words. It wasn't romantic, but there was something undeniably comforting in our connection. Grace had become an unexpected friend, someone who understood my scars without asking to heal them. In the weeks that followed, we grew closer, meeting up for coffee or art events, always finding something to laugh about or ponder together. There was a freedom in our friendship that allowed me to be fully myself, without the weight of expectation or pretense. Grace saw me as I was, no longer the man defined by betrayal, but someone learning to live and love life again. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I'd found someone who truly understood me, someone who saw the parts of me I'd worked so hard to reclaim. And in that understanding, I found a rare, comforting peace. My friendship with Grace brought a kind of clarity I hadn't known I needed. Spending time with her reminded me that there was more to life than reliving old pain and replaying what-ifs. She had a way of grounding me in the present, nudging me toward the things that mattered now, and helping me let go of the things that no longer served me. One evening, Grace invited me to join her at an art show she was hosting. Her work was bold, layered with color and emotion, each piece telling its own story of resilience and transformation. As I moved through the gallery, I felt a strange connection to her artwork. It was as if each painting mirrored parts of my own journey, the struggles, and the quiet triumphs. After the show, we sat in a corner of the gallery, watching people drift past her pieces. "Your work, it's incredible," I told her, genuinely moved. "You can feel the story behind each one." She gave me a grateful smile. Art became my way of processing everything. It let me turn the hardest parts of my life into something meaningful. Sometimes, creating something new is the only way to move forward. Her words struck a chord. I realized that was what I had been doing all along, creating a new life out of the broken pieces, letting each step forward redefine who I was. Grace had found her path, and in her friendship, I felt inspired to keep pursuing mine. In the weeks following the art show, I poured myself into my music with a renewed sense of purpose. Liam encouraged me to start writing my own songs, and with Grace's words lingering in my mind, I began to compose, turning my experiences into melodies and lyrics. Music became my outlet, a way to honor both the pain I'd endured and the growth I'd achieved. One night, I invited Grace to an open mic where I planned to debut one of my original songs. She showed up early, taking a seat near the stage, her presence a steady anchor that calmed my nerves. As I played, I felt the lyrics flow out, capturing everything I'd been through, the heartbreak, the loss, and the resilience I'd found along the way. The song ended to warm applause, but the only person I looked for in the crowd was Grace. She smiled at me, her eyes shining with encouragement, and I knew that this moment wasn't just a performance, it was a turning point. I was finally stepping into a new chapter, embracing who I was now, shaped but not defined by the past. Afterward, Grace came up to me, giving me a warm hug. "You did it, Jack," she said, pride in her voice. That was beautiful. For the first time, I felt truly proud of myself, not just for performing, but for how far I'd come. I had created something meaningful out of my pain, something that reflected not just the struggles but the strength I'd gained. And as I walked out of that venue with Grace by my side, I realized that I was no longer haunted by the past. I was free to embrace the present, one note, one step, and one moment at a time. In the months that followed, my life settled into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply fulfilling. My music continued to evolve, each song a reflection of my journey and the resilience I'd built. Grace became a constant presence, my friend, confidant, and companion in all the best ways. The closeness we shared was something I hadn't expected, but I embraced it, letting our bond grow naturally, without the pressure of defining it. One crisp evening, Grace and I found ourselves back at the same lake where we'd gone on our group camping trip. We sat on the shore, watching the sun set over the water, casting a golden glow that shimmered across the lake. The silence between us was comfortable, the kind that only comes when two people genuinely understand each other. Grace turned to me, her face thoughtful. "Jack, do you ever think about where you'd be if none of this had happened?" I paused, considering her question. "Sometimes," I admitted. "But honestly, I'm grateful for where I am now. Everything that happened led me here, to this moment, to a life that's actually mine." She smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "I'm glad too. I think sometimes life falls apart so we can rebuild it the way it was always meant to be." In that quiet moment, I realized that I no longer felt defined by the past or by the person I had been with Kathy. I was living fully in the present, surrounded by people who cared for me, and free from the weight of resentment and regret. I had rebuilt my life, found my own strength, and opened myself up to the possibility of something new. As the last rays of sunlight faded, I felt a deep sense of peace settle over me. I didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely excited to find out. Grace had shown me that life didn't have to be a series of closed chapters, it could be an open book, ready to be written, one day at a time. We walked back to the car, her hand still in mine, both of us quiet, but both of us knowing that this was just the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, I knew I was ready to face it, not alone, but with a newfound confidence and someone by my side who understood the journey I'd taken to get here. And as we drove away, I felt a warmth spread through me, a warmth that came from knowing that life, in all its ups and downs, was meant to be lived. I had found my strength, my freedom, and, with Grace, maybe even a chance at a new kind of love. The past was behind me, and the future was wide open, waiting for me to embrace it.